So I want to welcome everybody to the monthly edition of the Northern California Recycling Association Zero Waste Advocacy Committee's meeting. And if you were to make this a recurring thing on your calendar, second Tuesday every month, starting at 5 o'clock for cocktails, 5:30 for the show, then you won't need any reminders and you'll be pleasantly surprised when you tune in. Because we do two things on this show each month. We combine two things. We combine a segment from the Recycling Archives, which I'll talk about more in a second, and we try to combine that with a hot topic in recycling. And I try to connect the two things as best as I can. So, for example, for tonight's show, we're going to talk about things that do or don't benefit zero waste. And to me, there's a lot of things out there that are touted as promoting zero waste, and I can be convinced, but there's two reasons why it's not always clear. The first is you can always find scads of people out there to make it a plausible argument about anything. So for example, I look online and I see a group of academics in England that want to tell us that using single-use plastic is better than any environmental alternative. So maybe that may or may not be true. The second problem is that in zero waste, we talk about highest and best use, meaning that we recognize that we don't have infinitely great technology for everything, and we have to sometimes compromise. So for example, we don't like to burn stuff, but there's this stuff called medical waste, for example, that's out there that we can't figure out anything better to do with, so we burn it. That's considered highest and best use. Maybe not forever, because I would wager that 50 years from now, we will find some use for that discarded medical waste. There will be something to recover from it that they will use in science, but not today. So because it's not always clear whether something's good for zero waste or not for zero waste, we put together a show that combines two things. First is we asked the co-founder and CEO of a company that makes packaging that's derived from hemp and at the same time recovers ocean plastic litter. Well, those sound like two good things to me, but maybe they're not. So I invited a number of anti-plastic folks, people who might disagree with that premise, and we're gonna question this. We're gonna question Ron Basak-Smith, who's going to be on at 6 o'clock, about whether this is good or not after he gets to make a 10-minute presentation. And I think that, you know, if you're trying to get to the bottom of something, you know, it's always good to have a healthy discourse about it. So for the second part of the show, the Recycling Archives, where we highlight somebody who's really been a pioneer in recycling and zero waste, and we talk about their oral histories, I wanted to invite someone who's always, for the 40 years that I've known us, always brought a healthy skepticism to new ideas about zero waste. And she's tireless and she's uncompromising to the point where you can be your friend for 40 years. And if you say something that's just basically wrong about zero waste or something else she feels strongly about, she's going to tell you about it. So we're going to highlight her because we want to talk about that it's important when we're looking at zero waste to drill down, to drill down and ask enough questions so that you can finally apply a zero waste principle or a principle of physics and make a judgment realistically about whether something's good for zero waste or whether it isn't. So the first segment tonight is going to highlight Mary Lou Van Deventer of Urban Ore. And I will turn it over to Susan Kinsella, who is the director of the Recycling Archives, to remind us why we're doing the Recycling Archives project, and then to do Mary Lou's readings with her wonderful voice.
Thank you. Well, just a brief introduction to the Recycling Archives. Dan Knapp and Neil Seldman realized several years ago that a lot of the people that helped start the recycling system that we know today were getting older, were retiring, and we were starting to lose some of them. And yet we hadn't saved their history. And so they started an archives kind of interviewing process to figure out what kinds of things had they done, what kinds of issues had they run into, what were their visions and their values, and how might those actually help inform us today, struggling with kinds of issues that they didn't have to struggle with in the beginning. So it's been really fascinating. We've got over 70 interviews already, and we're going to be doing a whole lot more this year. And I keep finding that people that I've known for decades have so many surprises when we do an interview with them that it's pretty exciting as well. So let me talk about Mary Lou. In 2013, Neil Seldman of the Institute for Local Self-Reliance in Washington, D.C., did an interview with Mary Lou Van Devender of Urbanor. And then just a couple of months later, a couple of months ago, Mary Lou and Dan Knapp added more stories to that interview. So these excerpts tonight are taken from that combined updated interview. Mary Lou has been working for several decades now in the reuse and recycling arena, so it's quite surprising that when Neil asked her, "Do you think of recycling as a social movement at the time when you first became aware of it?" Mary Lou's answer was, "No, I didn't know what a social movement was. I'd been working as a speech and theater teacher, an English teacher, and I didn't know from social movements." Neil follows up with, "Did recycling excite you? And if so, why?" And Mary Lou answers, "Not at all. It was just a thing that made sense." And in fact, it was an unexpected crisis that threw Mary Lou into working on resource issues in the first place. As she tells it, "By 1976, I was an editor, part of a talented team working under Dave Brower at Friends of the Earth in San Francisco. I knew that Dave and the organization were going to do a very important policy book. It would be called Progress as if Survival Mattered, and it was to be published in time for the 1976 presidential election, which turned out to be between Jimmy Carter and Gerald Ford. But I wasn't involved in the book design or concept. I was working on the newspaper staff. We were aware there were a whole bunch of policy chapters on different topics, but I didn't know much yet and didn't know the field all that well. But we knew the book team had found a bunch of celebrity authors who were experts to write chapters in their policy areas. About 3 weeks before we had to turn the manuscript into the printer, a shocking thing happened. Whoever the celebrity was who was supposed to write the resource chapter just finked out. They didn't just quit, but declared that he or she, I forgot who it was, wasn't going to be able to finish the chapter or get anything in at all. A policy book on the environment and environmental protection without a chapter on resources. You couldn't have that. So Dave came downstairs to where the newspaper staff worked. We all worked in a big open room, and he said, "Hey," while effectively like clinking a spoon on a glass or something like that, "we need somebody to write a resources chapter for the policy book. Who wants to do the resources chapter for the book?" No hands went up. No hands went up. And I thought, I know nothing about resources. I'm a mere copy editor and typesetter. What do I know? I write book reviews, and I'm starting to write some other things. Give me a press release, I can rewrite it. I can make a couple of phone calls and add information, but I'm not an area expert of any kind. But I would take a stab at it. So I raised my hand, and I looked around to see who was my competition, and nobody was my competition. Nobody wanted the resources chapter. It was not sexy. It wasn't solar power or nuclear or wind. It wasn't the good stuff. Resources? What's that? And that's what I said. Resources? I don't know anything from resources. But there was no competition, and everybody just turned and looked at me and said, "Okay, you got it." Oh dear. And she laughs about it now. Now I'm going to have to quit what I'm doing and do this. We really did have a real life deadline. And all too soon, we were supposed to turn in a book-length manuscript for publishing. We had a printer date all set up. The pressure was on. I asked for a couple weeks of vacation time so I could get paid. I didn't go into work. I was sent home with a couple of armful loads of books. And I was given a whole bunch of very good contact phone numbers, experts in the field whom I could call up. So I went home and read and read and read and wrote and wrote. I just stayed in my apartment for a couple of weeks. And I turned in the chapter on resources on time. In the end, it was only 20 pages. I was irritated when they cut out my footnotes, but they accepted the text. They didn't want footnotes. I turned around 20 pages after a couple of weeks of work in a field I didn't know. It was an immersion and it was very interesting. The phone numbers that I was given got me in touch with some very interesting experts. I talked with heads of organizations that were doing lobbying on behalf of the environment. I talked with bureaucrats who knew a lot. All were sympathetic because Friends of the Earth people had high-level contacts with very solid people, and those people turned me on to other people. If you ever dream of diving into a pool of information and being in that vortex for a couple of weeks, that's what it was like. And it was big fun. It was just great. So I ended up with this chapter and I got almost no editing. They thought it was fine and they put it into the book. And it got read into the congressional record, which made me very proud. Okay, now remember, Mary Lou started out as an English teacher. So it's no surprise that she's very attuned to words and the correct way to use them. One of her first focus on words relating to the recycling world started with this book. And in talking about some of the things she learned in writing this chapter on resources, Mary Lou says, I learned a couple of basic things. Aside from the we mine X numbers of tons, one of them was that there are renewable resources and non-renewable resources. And that renewable resources can be made non-renewable if you just use them faster than the natural world can replenish them. So if you understand a few basic principles about how resources are used and developed, you can see and appreciate anew that it's only a little planet that we live on. It's a globe, and there's nowhere else to get this stuff once we run out. And so once we dig a hole in the ground and take all the resources out, we will eventually get to the last hole with high quality resources. And when we run out of the high quality ore, then we have to go for the lower quality ore. And that means you're going to be digging up a lot more land to get the same quantity of ore. So if you want to protect the wild places of the earth and deliver a planet to our children and their grandchildren that's anywhere near the same quality that we were delivered by our parents, especially in view of the population growth that's been happening rapidly, you're going to have to conserve the materials that you've gone to a lot of trouble to get out of the Earth's crust. Okay, now skip forward a bit past a lovely romantic story about how Dan and Mary Lou met and about their first kiss, but you're going to have to read the whole interview for that story, to when Mary Lou was working at the California State Office of Appropriate Technology, or OAT, as they called it, and was assigned to be Dan's project manager for a report that he was writing for them. That question about the word resources came up again. But again, I'm going to let Mary Lou tell it. At that moment, in all the recycling and waste literature, resource recovery was a code word for incineration. The well-funded incineration people, and all too many recyclers, were uniformly using resource recovery as a code word for burning garbage. They would say, we're recovering resources, energy, by burning all the discarded materials. Whoa, how can resource destruction, destroying materials, be resource recovery? It can't. So what to do? That conundrum was what Dan wanted to unravel. He wanted to take back the idea of resource recovery and use it for recycling because it didn't fit, and it didn't fit resource destruction. He was saying that you fight incineration by taking back the terminology and using it correctly. That's why he wanted to call his paper Resource Recovery, What Recycling Can Do. I was a soft touch on that. I had no idea how disruptive the title would be. I got it that using recycling that way means everything is potentially recyclable. And if Dan wanted to call total recycling a form of resource recovery, okay, that's fine with me. I soon learned that it was a political position to call recycling resource recovery instead of just recycling. To do this was not neutral. It was a political intrusion. It was rattling the cage of the people who were incinerator vendors and trying to sell waste to energy as a sustainable form of energy and a rebranded way of recovering resources. The last thing they wanted was competition for the discard supply. They thought they owned the word resource recovery. Recycling, they said, was only diversion. I found that the regulatory system had been rigged in favor of wasting by burning. At the time, the Public Utility Regulatory Policy Act, or PURPA, which was a federal rule, mandated that if you could get your incinerator funded under PURPA rules, then utilities were required to pay you for the power at the rate enjoyed by all companies creating new generating capacity, no matter how they were doing it. Because of that provision in PURPA, burn plant engineers were designing and building all kinds of alternative energy facilities. Investors were jumping in, hoping for profits. Incineration was going to become a great new big deal, financed by PURPA, which was also financing solar heating, solar cooling, wind energy, and all kinds of other good things. That's why the garbage to energy guys were trying to name it resource recovery, to muscle in a bad thing by joining it with a lot of good things, and thereby confuse the public and elected officials. Now, Neil says, now please let me ask you to elaborate on this point. You recently told a story to me and Dan about the contract that Dan signed when he wrote a white paper about recycling. The story of that contract is important here. And Mary Lou answers, the contract came to Dan after I left OAT. He and I had begun living together. I knew something about publishing, and so I looked at his contract for writing the paper that he had in mind. I found the contract was fundamentally a work for hire proposition, and the state would own the copyright to the work. So I advised him, don't sign this contract this way. Get this provision changed. You need to own your copyright. You can share it, but you've got to have control over the material. And he said, okay. And so he told that to the Office of Appropriate Technology, and they referred him to the legal department. They said, nobody negotiates these contracts. This is the state of California. This is our standard contract. And Dan said, but I want to change this provision. And they said, well, we don't do that. And Dan said, well, ask. And the legal department got back to him after they asked. And the answer was yes, he could change that and negotiate that position. So he got the right to retain ownership of his intellectual property. This became important later, after the paper got written. So Dan wrote the manuscript. He turned it over to the state, but by then, staff had changed at OAT. Policy had also changed, which they disagreed with, but they had to follow directives. So they said, well, this is very anti-incinerator. The recycling stuff is very good, but it's anti-incineration, so take that part out. And Dan said, I can't take it out. It's an inherent part of the overall argument because incineration is such a big deal and it's the wrong thing to do. He and I edited it and we toned it down and he turned it in again, but they still weren't happy. So then he asked, when are you going to publish? And they said, well, we probably aren't going to do that right away. And he said, are you going to deep six it? And basically they said, well, yeah. And so he said that I'm going to have to publish it. And they said, well, you can't. And in the interview, both Neil and Mary Lou yelled basically in unison, yes, I can. So we published it as Resource Recovery, What Recycling Can Do. We printed many copies and gave it away to many people. And that, along with a few other publications we wrote, successfully beat down the plans for several incinerators. And that's how we took back the term resource recovery after it had been captured by the burn plant industry. Doing that was a very important exercise for me. Taking back the language is critical to recycling's development. Now, Dan and Mary Lou took back another term and defined it correctly as well. Here's a very short excerpt about that. Neil starts out talking about it and encourages Mary Lou to tell the story. Neil says, just the other day, Dan gave a very short but important statement that recycling, composting, and reuse are disposal mechanisms too. He said disposal is not just landfills and incinerators, which are wasting disposal. His point is that recycling, reuse, and composting are competing disposal systems, and they are conserving disposal systems, not wasting disposal systems. That's a huge difference. That was an important addition to the thinking. Mary Lou says, that's correct English usage too. If you want to get rid of something, you're disposing of it. You can dispose of it by wasting, or you can dispose of it by conserving. This is another question of terminology and seizing and retooling a thought process that has been corrupted by the wasting industry. The conventional wisdom has seized everybody's thought process by saying something is disposal only if it's wasting. They say that if you're conserving, you're diverting materials from wasting disposal. Wasting disposal is the natural destiny for anything discarded, according to that thinking, but that's wrong. What that mind trickery does is to set aside the disposal service money for the wasters. It allows them to monopolize the lion's share of the disposal service, all the money that's part of the disposal service. In this muddled thinking process, conserving disposal, which means reuse, recycling, and composting, doesn't get paid for its service, only for its products. And meanwhile, wasters get guaranteed profits, all from disposal fees because they have no product to sell, only a liability. Neil says, yeah, and Dan used some wonderful examples to illustrate this point. If you're an accountant and you're disposing of the assets of a business, you don't dig a hole and bury them, nor do you pile them up and burn them. No, you inventory, curate, and sell the remaining assets. You're paid to maximize their value. That's what recyclers do. It's the same thing if you're a lawyer disposing of a deceased person's estate. If you waste their assets by destroying them, you won't be a lawyer very long. And Mary Lou says, a corporation can even be sued for committing waste of assets. Committing waste sounds bad, doesn't it?
Very nicely done. Thank you, Susan.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Dan.
Thanks.
So
Thank
Mary,
you, Susan. That was really good.
It
That was
fun
good.
too.
so Mary Lou, is the using the correct term resource recovery still important? That was a long time ago.
Well, using the terms correctly is always important, because what you're doing is you're describing your thought process and you're describing your value system at the time that you speak. So are you recovering resources when you burn something? No, you're not doing it any more today than you would have been, 20 years ago. It's always important to use the correct terminology in these circumstances, especially for the development of the recycling industry, which has taken itself out of the competition too many times to count. It's amazing how recyclers have not framed their discussion in ways that are beneficial to the industry they say they're trying to promote. They go into the middle of the arena and they flog themselves and they say everybody should feel guilty for not doing what we want them to, and then they cry and they think people should be on their side on that account. That is not a winning strategy. They need Karl Rove designing their presentation. They need a Karl Rove of the Angels to describe their PR strategy and how this is to be presented to people. The public love recycling, and recyclers don't take advantage of it. I don't understand.
Well, I'm going to come back and have a question or two, but I want to open it up to the floor for anybody else who wants to talk to Mary Lou about her career and how she got to where she is.
I'm in the kitchen. That's where I am. I'm in the kitchen.
With a globe in your background showing, I think, methane at the poles.
That's methane at the poles. Yes, that's a 1999 NASA image where they profiled all the gases in the atmosphere and they wanted to find out how much methane is there. So they colored the methane green. And when they used to have a video on their website, which I captured. And so I have a copy of it, although in the previous administration, that video was taken down. But I have a copy of it. And when you turn the earth spinning, those little curvy places up there, blip, 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 those, it's, and especially down in Australia, the earth spins and the methane waves lap the Australian beaches. Methane spins to the poles, and methane is up to 100 times more, contributes up to 100 times the warming impact of CO2 as carbon dioxide, and it does it in the short term. So, you know, methane at the poles, that's going to melt the ice caps, period.
So why are they coloring methane green in that picture, which makes it seem like a good thing as opposed to putting a little death's head on it or something like that?
Well, I haven't asked them. I don't know.
All right. Ruth, you had a question?
Yeah, Mary Lou. So I know you've mentored many people over your career. What would you say is the best thing we should do to bring up the next generation of zero wasters? What are you doing and what should we all be doing?
Social media. I think social media, I am guilty. I have not done social media as effectively as so many people, but if we, you know, those videos that the NCRA players made, Ruth, put them up online, you know, and let's promote them because they really make good points in an amusing way. There are lots of comedians who do wonderful send-ups of this or that or the other thing, and they can do them like once a week. You know, Randy Rainbow, oh boy, you know, somebody like that. They really make a hit and they become, they go viral. They just, not physically viral, which is what we're all trying to avoid. But, you know, if you put up good, short, little amusing, well done videos and you get some people to forward them around, you can be really persuasive and people will tune into you faster than they'll tune into NPR or CBS or NBC or anybody like that. I think that we educate, we go where the audience is, and they're on TikTok.
So
Mary Lou?
NCRA needs a TikTok.
Yes.
Mary Lou, you call it, speaking of social media, you call yourself by a moniker, anti-entropy.
Yeah.
Why did you choose that moniker?
I'm against it. Entropy is the second law of thermodynamics, which says a lot of different things. Einstein said the laws of thermodynamics will never be repealed. And I think you know, who am I to say? Einstein is pretty good for me, and I'll take him as an expert. And the second law of thermodynamics says that every time a material changes form, we'll apply it to recycling. Every time a material changes form, it releases energy. So if you want to release a lot of energy from some material, you'll burn it and it'll release a lot of energy in the form of heat. But then of course you lose the material. Now, if you want to conserve the material, then you try not to change its form if you don't have to. And that way you won't lose any heat. The entropy is the law of disorder. When we become a mess. You know, you change the form of something, you take a piece of wood and you chop it up all into little bits and it makes a mess. It releases a lot of extra energy and you cannot reform it into something new unless you apply a lot of energy from an outside source. So entropy makes a mess and I'm against it.
Well, let me bring in Bonnie. Are you there? Since Mary Lou brings up social media, in answer to Ruth's question, as NCRA's social media direction, do you find that zero waste is getting traction on social media? And if not, what could we do to make change?
Zero waste is getting traction on social media, especially around zero waste lifestyle hacks.
Mhm.
And our audience does care a lot about zero waste. So just making sure we have the content in place to promote that. And as Mary Lou had mentioned, short videos are really popular. So we could look into the idea of a TikTok, although perhaps the TikTok account could be shared among the members and the board members. So we could discuss that further in the social media committee.
So we just have to find someone to make TikToks then.
Yeah, and you need to have somebody who's a screener who doesn't let things get online that are not the right stuff.
So can I ask you a David Brower question
Oh, yeah.
before I segue into our next segment?
Love David Brower, yeah.
So in the last 2 centuries, there haven't been too many people that were more passionate and effective advocates for the environment than David Brower, who you
That's
work.
right.
So in his time, like today, there must have been a lot of dissenting views against what he thought was right. And there were a lot of people who could make plausible arguments against him. So what did he find for his moral compass to discern whether something was good for the environment or it wasn't? How did he make that judgment, if you know?
Well, when we were working on the newspaper, we all made that judgment, and it always just sort of seemed obvious, because you look at a proposed idea and you ask, does it fit in seamlessly with how the earth conducts the earth's business, with how the earth's processes work? And if it doesn't fit in seamlessly with that, you have to start asking pointy little questions, because it's not going to work very well. You know, nuclear power was the thing that separated him from the Sierra Club. The Sierra Club liked nuclear power. It was low carbon, as many environmentalists are saying again today. It's low carbon footprint. Yeah, that's fine. Okay. Now then, once you use that for making heat, basically to boil water, to make electricity, you're using it for its lowest possible value. So you're making heat to boil water, and you're going to generate electricity with that, and you're going to wheel this electricity all over the place and lose a lot of it in the transmission lines. And then you're going to have spent nuclear fuel. What are you going to do with that spent nuclear fuel? What are you going to do with it? It will be toxic to anything living for 240,000 years. That's a long time. What are you going to do? He didn't see anything to do with it. And so that is a technology that did not fit seamlessly into the way the earth works. And I said one time, well, what about instead of a nuclear reactor, we have, what's the other kind of nuclear reactor? It's what the sun uses. It's what the sun does. And I said, well, why don't we use this kind of reactor? And he said, well, but this, what?
Fusion.
Fusion. And I said, fusion power instead of fission. And he said, well, the sun does use that, and that's about as close as a fusion reactor ought to be. So we have a fusion reactor doing it already. And you wouldn't want one on the planet, because they're even nastier than a fission reactor. You know, if it doesn't fit in with the planet's processes easily, then it's probably a bad idea.
I like that. I like the idea of that. Does it or does it not seamlessly fit in with how the world actually works? I think that's a good way to segue into our next segment. So thank you, Susan. Thank you, Mary Lou, for joining us. Thank you for your service. Please stay on if you can.
I can stay on, and I thank Susan. Thanks a lot. You made me sound really interesting.
Well,
appreciate it.
it's great. material to work with.
And Mary Lou, of course, Ruth, I'm sorry, you have a question?
No, I was clapping,
Oh, well,
Oh, thank you.
clapping.
Hey, Ruth. Yeah,
so Ron, if you're ready, Ron Basak-Smith is the CEO and co-founder of Sana Packaging. Sana makes packaging products from hemp, not petrochemicals. They recover ocean plastic litter. And he's going to talk about why those are good things and perhaps use Mary Lou's David Brower definition of is it consistent with the seamless way the world works? So I'm going to turn it over to him and then we'll ask questions.
Cool. Awesome. Thanks, John. Appreciate you guys having me out today to give my presentation. Unfortunately, I was going to have some stuff that I was going to share via my screen, but my computer charger broke today, and so I am working with just my phone right now. But nonetheless, I think I can, basically kind of give you an overview of what we do as a company, why we do it, and what we're trying to accomplish within the cannabis packaging space. So as John was saying, I'm co-founder and CEO of Sana Packaging, and myself and co-founder, we started this company basically as disgruntled cannabis consumers. We were looking at the market. I'd been living in Colorado since legalization and just saw a whole new industry opening up with single-use packaging and with no real game plan around it. And unfortunately, because of some of the nuances of cannabis packaging, almost all of it was not even getting, if it was going into the recycling system, it was not being recycled. And so, just kind of from that standpoint, realized, hey, there's a whole new industry starting. There's kind of these nuances around regulation. What can we do to try to get this industry off on a better foot than some of the other, single-use industries that we see out there? The first premise of our business model, just to kind of start this, we are a material agnostic company. We are not a manufacturer. We are not a compounder. We consider ourselves to be a packaging brand. And by that, I mean that we will connect a material type and a manufacturing process and design packaging that meets the needs of the cannabis industry from a regulatory standpoint, as well as the products itself. So the first thing we started to make, this is I don't know how well you can see it with this lighting, but it's a pre-roll tube. It's one of the most common form factors in the cannabis packaging space. One of the big regulatory asks from the cannabis industry is that the packaging be made from something that is child resistant. And so that's what we went out and we designed, was packaging that was child resistant. And then our first goal was to create packaging that was 100% plant-based, and then also using byproducts from the cannabis industry itself, that being the hemp plant. And so we use the hurd, which is the innard of the stalk. That's we micronize it and then compound that with a PLA, which you might be familiar with as typically a corn-based polymer. And so this product is 100% plant-based. And then, as John was mentioning, we also do a reclaimed ocean-bound plastic line. And so this is in partnership with a company called OceanWorks. They are a network of processors, cleaners, and sorters. And they basically supply our manufacturers with the reclaimed material that is ocean-bound, which is 50 kilometers inland or coastal, off the coast in the ocean. So that's where that material is coming from. And, for us as a company, we kind of see this in two different ways. As I said, we're material agnostic. I think, unfortunately, just as a society and as people, we've been kind of conditioned to think about waste just downstream. But from a packaging standpoint and environmental impact, I think it makes sense to look at both sides of the supply chain. So, the inputs going into the product, and then, how does that product and then interact in a waste recovery system? And so, the concept of the plant-based products that are looking more so upstream at the inputs that go into it, trying to create single-use products out of out of renewable material, non-finite materials. So plant-based products, hemp-based biocomposites. So something that, hemp being a rapidly renewable resource that uses less water and does not degrade the soil. And some may even say regenerative to the soil, depending on how it's cultivated. And so, it doesn't make sense for us to try to start transitioning some of these single-use products into plant-based materials and finding markets where people are going to pay the increased cost for these new and developing materials. And then on the flip side of it, looking at a material like reclaimed ocean-bound material, we're also launching a line of product made from recycled content packaging here in the state, locally here in the state of Colorado. So the material is collected here in Denver, sorted, compounded, and then manufactured here in Denver, and then sold to cannabis companies that are looking to package products. So it's kind of a multi-pronged approach there in terms of the materials that we're using. Some that are more of a upstream impact, and then the recycled content stuff, we see it as more of a downstream impact, and then the ocean material, we see it as a stranded resource that isn't where it should be. And so the concept there is, let's get that back into a usable form of material, and then hope that the second lifespan through it ends up in the proper waste system and not out in the environment. We also cannabis packaging is really tricky because there's so many different product types. We have flower, we have edibles, there's pre-rolls, there's concentrate, there's beverages. And so there's not just a single form factor that's going to work in the industry. We would obviously like to see the cannabis industry move away from a single use model. I think that is inherently one of the issues. When someone asks what is sustainable packaging, the response that I can give, best response that I can give is no packaging. Unfortunately, the way the industry is designed, our consumer expectations, we're going to have the packaging, and there's going to be a lot of different types of packaging and variations within that packaging. So, I always use the comparison to the liquor industry. When you go and purchase a bottle of liquor, you largely are recognize the brand that you're purchasing based upon the shape and design of the bottle. And so packaging different from cutlery at like a to-go place plays a role in the purchasing decision and the brand awareness. And so that's where it becomes really difficult to just design kind of this one size fits all ideal packaging type for an industry like cannabis, similar to liquor, where differentiated packaging is going to dictate consumer perception and consumers' desire to purchase. So those are just the things around, ideally we would like single use or a reuse model, but because these are consumer packaged goods on the shelf, the model that works right now and that the industry has adopted is that single use model. So how can we help supplement that and find systems that work to take back this material and make sure that it's not just being wasted or ending up outside in the environment. We've had a really great reception within the cannabis space. Where is it? Yeah, I think like this last year we reclaimed 310,000 pounds, so 155 tons of ocean material. And we used about 140,000 pounds of hemp-based biocomposite. And so, I think in the larger scheme of the packaging world, like those numbers aren't large. But in the cannabis space, we're really starting to find a group of customers that are looking to have less impactful packaging and looking to are willing to spend the increased cost to transition away from, what is considered the lowest cost packaging that might not even be recyclable, might be made out of mixed materials, or, made out of toxic materials. There's just a, kind of a wide range of packaging quality within the cannabis space right now due to it not being federally regulated. And so the regulations around cannabis packaging are not the same that you'd see in the, traditional food and beverage space right now. So, but moving in that direction, I think it's going to take some time. So yeah, I'm happy to, kind of open up floor to questions now.
So it sounds like the packaging regulations differ by states. Is that right?
Correct. Yeah, exactly. They differ by state. I mean, they're generally very similar. I think the other thing beyond just regulations would be just kind of the consumer norms around how things are being done in that state. But yeah.
So if I'm in a cannabis store, and I've been in a cannabis store, and there's a lot of products, and they're all seem to have plastic packaging or something that looks like plastic packaging. So if I wanted to make a conscious choice to buy a product that wasn't made from petrochemicals, that had some sort of ability to be part of a circular economy, how would I know what to pick? What would it say to tell me where to look?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's really one of the difficulties for us as a company is how do we get the consumer to recognize what is sustainable packaging, or have the person selling the bud tender who's selling the cannabis inform the consumer of their options around sustainable cannabis packaging. It's really difficult, and I think that's why for us we're out there trying to build a packaging brand. So what we do, and this is something you might not see, I don't know how well you're going to be able to see this, but you can see on the bottom of this jar, it calls out our brand, and this jar is made out of 100% reclaimed ocean plastic. And so once the consumer has brought the product or interact with the product, they potentially will see this. We also, some of our customers will put out call outs on the packaging itself, but still these are really difficult things for someone to see within a purchasing decision. And so I think that's what makes it difficult with packaging in general to get people to spend more money on it, is that if they can't get the consumer to see the perceived value of it, and attract that person to buy their product, then why would they do it? And that, is kind of comes down to us trying to do differentiated shapes. So hopefully someone can recognize, hey, that's sauna packaging. I had it before. There is a little bit of that with bud tenders. People will ask, I think if someone at the store asks like, hey, do you have any products packaged in sustainable packaging? The bud tender might be able to lead them in that direction, but it's our biggest battle as a company, basically, is figuring out how we can get our sustainability messaging more visible.
Well, I see a lot of hands up for questions, so I'm going to open it up. I want to say that, Ron took a risk to show up to a recycling association event where there were going to be a lot of anti-plastic people participating, and I can see some of those people on this call. And so I just want to say thank you for doing it and remind everybody that effective discourse to me is done by questioning. And sometimes I go to conferences and people who are opposed to things, they just want to get up and make a statement. But I think questions are better. So I'm going to ask for people to be polite, ask questions, and I'll start with Mary Lou, who had their hand up first.
Thank you very much, John. I really like the hemp packaging for the pre-roll. First of all, it looks like a cigar. So it looks like the product that's in it, sort of, or in the same family. But for the plastic thing, it's recovered plastic from the ocean, and getting it out of the ocean is wonderful, wonderful. But then you make it into a product, and so I guess you said you want to make sure it gets into an appropriate disposal system. And plastics right now are real bad for an appropriate disposal system. I don't even know, you harvest plastic from the ocean that could be some plastic is thermoplastic, so it gets more plastic as you heat it, and others is thermoset. And I don't think anybody probably screened the stuff coming from the ocean because it's hard to screen in the first place, and that kind of detritus you're not going to be able to do. So what would it take for you to what would it take for you to be able to roll out a plastic made from an clearly superior source to get it out of the ocean, but then it becomes something that isn't recyclable, or is it? Or how do you go about identifying whether it can be recycled in any given community?
Yeah, so that's, uniquely we're seeing the issue with cannabis packaging as a whole, is that whether it's ocean material or virgin material that's been manufactured one time, it's still not being recycled. A lot of the packaging material right now in the industry is a number 5 polypropylene.
Yeah.
Most of the stuff that we were working with, we do have a number 5 offering, but most of our products are a number 1 or number 2, so an HDPE or PET. And what we're proposing and what we want to see in the cannabis space is a closed loop system where the cannabis packaging is brought back into the dispensary and then is collected and sorted from that standpoint, instead of putting it into the larger recycling system that has all these difficulties that you've mentioned. And so just being able to collect the packaging back at the source locally. And that's what our pilot program that we're doing in Denver. We just got a grant from Colorado Department of Health that basically we're going to be producing pre-rolled tubes made from material collected from dispensaries within the state of Colorado, and then also tap into the pre-existing polypropylene supply chain that is here, and that is, unfortunately doesn't have uses for and has fallen, the market for it's fallen out.
So you've put a lot of thought into what are you going to do with the package? So are you going to have a container deposit on your packaging?
That's
so
what we would like
to
to
take it back. Yeah.
That's what we would like to see implemented. So like, how do we get the industry to move away from just a single-use throwaway mindset to valuing those materials more, so that they can be collected and reused? Like a product like this, for example, or like we would like to see a reuse model for glass packaging. So like for flour and stuff, here's a glass jar. This could be cleaned and sanitized. This is where it gets difficult within the cannabis space. State by state, things different as far as where the product is packaged. So in Colorado and Oregon, we have like a deli style. So that would be similar to like a beer growler refill model for flour. So like there's a potential for a reuse model, but there's also some nuances that make it really difficult, like especially in states like that don't have deli style, that have everything come prepackaged. So then there's another point of contact where this has to get to. So that's kind of, and then you think of products like beverages and edibles and stuff like that. There's still it's not like a to-go product, so having that reuse model is difficult. Well, it's what we would like to see in the industry. And then from a plastic standpoint, as far as things being brought back into the store, that way they don't enter. So like what we're seeing is that a lot of the smaller, these size products and stuff with the recycling system these are just getting through and not getting caught. And so if these could be brought back to a dispensary and kept there, and then there's a company, for example, in Colorado called Green for Green, they're the ones who are going and sorting these materials and trying to keep them in reuse as much as possible.
But how would you incentivize a customer to bring back one of those tubes?
That's another thing that we're working on in this pilot program, is trying to understand what how to get higher rates of people bringing back product, and what incentive, what incentives work for that. There's going to be this super environmentally conscious folks that are going to do it anyways, and then there's going to be folks that can do it when it's convenient, and then there's going to be folks that are going to be money motivated or incentive motivated. And so is it the type of thing, I think in New York State there was a proposal for a bill where you'd put a deposit in on your packaging. So when you purchase the product, let's just say there's $1 deposit on the package itself. When you bring back the package, you would get that $1 back or go to your next purchase or something like that. So there's just some examples of, how incentives might look.
Liz, did you have a question?
Yeah, I did. I'm sorry, I'm working with my fingers, so I don't have my awesome picture up. I have a quick question for you, Ron. Have you guys, that cannabis material is just like sitting there asking to be used, and I'm glad to see somebody's looking for uses, but have you guys explored having it be a compostable product instead of working towards a plastic product, which is, as you know, problematic, and as you also probably know, PLAs are not accepted in composting systems for all kinds of reasons. But it's just sitting there like asking to be composted, in my opinion.
Yep. Yeah. So, ideally we would like to create compostable packaging. I think the difficult thing with cannabis packaging specifically, or anything rigid, is just the wall thickness and breakdown period of that. And does that work in an industrial compost facility? And then also just the access to compost facilities is very limited across the country. And so for some states, California being one of those, compost is definitely more of a reality than it is in a lot of the other states. And so I think you will start seeing some more compostable options come on the market from a packaging standpoint. They're going to be flexibles. But for us, it's just been a hurdle, and it's why you don't see compostable packaging is the wall thickness thing, and that really comes into play when making a child-resistant product that's strong enough or rigid enough to resist tampering.
Okay, thanks.
Susan, you had a question?
Yeah. So I'm really interested in the plastic from the ocean. I've done recycled product research for like several decades, and particularly in the paper industry, but also a lot of times for federal, state, and local purchasers who are trying to figure out, is this really counting as environmental, et cetera. And so when I talk to the people in the plastics industry, and I've had to learn a lot about their products, one, I've learned that plastics 1 and 2 are really recyclable. I mean, they're the most easily recyclable in our current system. But 2, then they talk about, unless you're doing something like picnic tables or something, you usually can't combine them. Then they talk about sometimes to recycle the plastics, they get brittle, or there's different problems with them and everything. So then I think about the ocean plastics and think they've been swirling around probably for years. They've got a lot of sun that's been degrading them and everything. And yet you're talking about knowing that you're ending up with number 1 or 2 or 5 or something. So I'm just wondering, what kind of condition are these in once they get to you, and how do you actually work with it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, when we think of this concept of ocean plastic, I think I don't know, whatever reason it is, our brains go to like that big gyre swirling plastic out in the ocean. That material, so our material it's ocean bound material. And so that means that it's within 50 miles of coastline entering the ocean or off of the coastline. So the real idea behind ocean material is actually capturing the material before it enters the ocean and starts swirling around for several years. And so unfortunately, because of our broken waste system, a lot of these materials are entering waterways in Asia, mainly in Africa as well, in some of these developing countries. And so those materials are now entering the waterways through rivers and then getting into the ocean. And so the ocean bound materials, a lot of it is collected at those water, in those rivers. And so the material is, there's different grades of ocean material. As I think in the recycling world, people will probably largely refer to as the melt flow index, basically, of how that material will perform in a manufacturing process. And so, when we're sourcing different ocean bound material, we're demanding that the material source has a specific melt flow index to allow us to create quality products. And so, to answer your question, I think it's largely up to our the collectors and the processors that we work with, that they're producing something that meets the spec that our manufacturer requires. And so, we've been able to create really, high-end quality products.
So it sounds like you're saying that they collect a mess of things, even if it's in rivers or whatever, and then they do the sorting into different types of plastic. And then you can say, I need this particular type, and get that separated out for you already.
Exactly. It's a commoditized supply chain, basically. And as a packaging company, that's really important to us, is just being able to get consistent material that meets, the needs of our manufacturing process.
So
And you said you also you get some from the Denver recycling collections. And is that all plastics, or do you get into other kinds of materials too?
Nope. So right now we're piloting the program so polypropylene is currently the #1 used material for cannabis packaging. And so there's just an abundance of polypropylene tubes that look exactly like this in the state and across the country, really. And so those tubes are now being collected. And then with that material, we're going to remanufacture and try to keep a closed loop system within the state.
Thank you.
So I wanted to follow up the ocean plastic. I can't think of an industry that has more complicated regulations than cannabis. I just can't possibly think of that. And it's made all the more difficult as you, in your business, when you're crossing state lines and doing business in different places. So it's exponentially difficult. So in light of that, and the fact that you have a hemp-based product that you're already using, why bother dealing with the ocean plastic, except to be able to say you're dealing with the ocean plastic?
Yeah, no, unfortunately with the hemp stuff, we're working with a hemp-based biocomposite. And so the chemistry of hemp has not been changed. It's just a micronized herd. And then we're working with a PLA. We're looking at some other options with PHA. It's another material type some folks might have heard of. But basically the injection molding process around hemp-based biocomposites is very limited in terms of what can be produced and what meets the needs of cannabis packaging at this point in time. And so only very specific products will work with the stuff that we can design with hemp. And unfortunately, because the product isn't 100% polymer, it's a biocomposite, it's hydrophilic, meaning that the hemp herd is attracted to moisture. Anything that is being stored for long term in cannabis wants something that is going to be hydrophobic. And so hemp is not, in its current iteration, is not the ideal material type for cannabis packaging. It works for some things, but we really want to see a material change in the science and the compounding of hemp-based polymers before we as a company invest more in those product lines. And so for us to build a profitable business, we need to have other material types that have different capabilities and different characteristics that allow us to fill a larger subsect of the market.
Even with the processing difficulties that must entail. Mary Lou, you have a question?
Well, yeah, I hope it's a short question or is only a short answer. How do you, aside from the collectors you're getting some of your plastics from the recycling collection system, but you're getting some from people who intercept these things in the streams or at the stream. Who does that?
Yeah,
What
so
kind of people do that?
yeah, so a company called Oceanworks is our network of suppliers, and they basically there's hundreds of different outfits out there where there's people being paid to go out and collect these materials. There's various forms all around the country, all around the world, and we work with Oceanworks basically as a vetting process to make sure that there's a living wage being paid, that there's clean facilities where the operations are happening for sorting. There's running water, there's air conditioning.
They're scavenging and they're scrounging. Is that right?
I think there's various
My
degrees of
company
it.
scavenges and scrounges. My company salvages for reuse
Yeah,
at a transfer station, but going out into the wild at the stream side is a real, that's sort of a rough cut there.
yeah. I mean, it's very labor intensive work as far as, but a lot of it is collected. Like they'll put up a net where the materials are collected, right? And so then there'll be a collection point where someone will go and periodically collect those materials.
So if we did a beach
This is all
cleanup in
very cool.
California and brought all the bottles to you, could you use them?
Yeah, I mean, we'd have them, go to a compounder who would sell it into a marketplace, basically.
A new marketplace. There we go. It's a new industry and it's developing new marketplaces. I love it.
Which is labor intensive and recovers materials.
Mhm.
Anybody else have any questions for Ron?
Yeah, I do.
Dan?
Yeah, this is really about something that's puzzled me for years. Plastics are really better known as polymers, I'd say. It would really be better if we talked about them as polymers, because we'd be talking about the molecular structure. So polymers then are molecules that are identical pretty much, and they're basically linked together by chemical bonds in very complex structures that are essentially like big sheets of molecules. But then we talk about how plastics break down, and they break down by age. I know that from experience, your computer after a while turns from gray to green. That's the beginning of a breakdown process. There's things that happen even faster with certain kinds of plastics. Sunlight degrades plastics and all the rest. So in that breakdown process, you're now familiar with a lot of plastics and how they break down and what their conditions are as they break down. But the thing that bothers me is that people a lot of times say, plastics never break down, they're always there. And I don't believe that. But my question then comes down to, what do plastics break down into when they break down? Do they, first of all, break down into molecules or just kind of like portions of sheets of molecules? But then after that, what happens? Do they then continue to be molecules of whatever it was that made up the plastics? And are they still plastics, or do they break down into atoms? And once they break down to atoms, are they plastics anymore?
That is a great question. So I am not a chemist, and I am that's not I'm not a compounder. My understanding is that when they're breaking down polymers, it goes to a monomer, and monomers are put together to make polymers. So I guess that would be my first kind of point to go to, is that it's just breaking down into a monomer.
The monomers, then what?
The
monomers are collections of atoms.
Mm-hmm.
So once the monomers are there and they're full of carbon,
yeah,
whether they're made out of petroleum or out of plant material, they've got a lot of carbon.
Yep.
Carbon is basically food for any, any kind of living thing. All living things are based on, are carbon based. Our
Yep.
bodies are, big percentage of our body is carbon.
Yep.
And so they break down into molecules. And I mean, first of all, they break down into monomers. And then after monomers comes atoms, right? And
Mhm.
once they're atoms, it doesn't seem to me that they're plastics anymore. Or polymers, either one.
Yeah, I mean, I think our understanding is that it goes into some form of a microplastic.
Yeah, but that's just saying it gets smaller and smaller. But
Yeah, it just is smaller and smaller. And I mean, I don't have an answer to what
Okay.
is happening once
Gotcha.
gone past the.
Well, at least the question got asked, and I'm glad of that.
So
Yeah.
I have a simpler question, kind of in the same vein, which is, I get a lot of food products that have plastic packaging. Drives me nuts to be able to figure out how to take it off, and then it's there, and what do you do with it? And well, it doesn't go into the compost bin. Where else does it go? I'm not taking these things back to Amazon or to CVS or places. But the cannabis products, to me, kind of have the same thing. They're little tiny things. They're plasticky. And although I like the cigar tube product that you've got, I'm not saying packaging products in a cannabis store that I'm likely to do anything with other than throw them in the garbage. So if you're making cannabis products and they're just going in the garbage, that's not different than anything else, is it?
You're saying the packaging itself?
Yeah, how is Santa going to keep me from throwing those little bits of things in the garbage?
That is not, we can't prevent that.
Okay.
I mean, that would be, the hope that people can find as much reuse for it. But these are packaging. The packaging itself is designed as single use.
Yeah.
Throwaway product. And I think that's the issue, right? Like that's what we as an industry are fighting against, is how do we build an industry that doesn't rely on a single use model for packaging.
Yeah, we're struggling with that out here a lot.
Yep. Yeah.
Are there any other questions for Ron?
And just a comment on the returning, the idea of, how can you get people to return it? And I remember early on, I was learning about some of the return kinds of opportunities in Germany and other countries in Europe. And they even apparently, I don't know if they're still doing this, but they would pack, if you buy a computer, they would pack it into a suitcase basically, and you take it home and set up your computer, and then you'd bring that suitcase back. And so I started talking about that here in the US, but people were saying, but Americans wouldn't do that. For one, we have to drive much larger distances in order to return something. So then I think about, if you have to sort out, okay, this goes to the cannabis store, this should go to the grocery store, this should go to CVS or whatever, and you've got all these different stores, then that becomes pretty challenging for people too. And I'm just trying to think of how it could work.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is the difficult thing, and why, like in the US, we've kind of tried to simplify things, right, with the single stream system. Yeah. And that's presented all these problems in and of itself, right? And so I think, and then, from my understanding, what I've seen is that the cost of managing packaging waste is oftentimes more than the revenue derived from the packaging that's trying to be managed. And so this creates really what I see as like an economics and systems problem, as far as what we as a society plan to do with our waste, and basically the value we put on it and how much we're willing to spend to manage it, to manage the negative externalities that are created by the model that we're choosing currently. And so I think it is that difficult question of, is it on the consumer to go and sort all these things and take the time? And I think that's largely, where a lot of consumers are upset now with recycling, is that they've been taking the time to do that stuff, but then seeing like, oh, it's not getting recycled. Why am I wasting my time doing that? And then with cannabis packaging, that can be even exaggerated more due to some of the, the size of the packaging and stuff, or material types. Goes to that question, I think, around, do you need to incentivize the consumer, reward the consumer for separating and, basically recovering, keeping the material in a system that's going to recover it or reuse it to its best of life cycle.
Yeah, thanks.
Well, Ron, thank you. I'm going to echo a comment from one of the most fervent anti-plastic people on this call, who puts in the chat, thank you for trying and caring. So thank you for trying and caring. Thank you for trying and caring in a business that has incomprehensible regulatory challenges and barriers to entry to market. And I respect you're doing it. I hope for the best for you. And, you're welcome to stay on, but at the end of this, committee meeting, we end up with an open forum where people can bring up their newish concerns. So you're welcome to stay on, but I think thank you for joining.
Yeah, thanks. Really appreciate you guys having me. This is fun. I enjoy, I approached this and started Sana because I'm an anti-packaging, anti-plastics person, and really just trying to find an industry that is receptive to trying to do things differently and figuring out new solutions to what is largely a really just difficult question, difficult problem. And that's the world of single-use packaging, regardless of what material it is. So yeah, just thanks for the opportunity to come on and discuss with you guys.
Okay, thanks, Ron. So now we're done with the show. We always have an open forum for people who want to bring up new things. I know that Mr. Boone, who is on the call, wants to bring up something, but it's not just about him. So if there's anything else anybody wants to say to suggest that something new that Nick ought to get involved in, or that we ought to TikTok, now's the time.
Hello, am I on?
Can I just ask one question?
Sure.
I would like, well, I guess it's a statement. I would like to see more people who are trying to do something, more people like that, who are making an effort to do something that working in a realm that maybe we would normally be opposed to, but they're trying to do something innovative and go in the right direction. I would just love to talk to people that who are not in my corner exactly, and expand our exposure for ourselves.
Well, I hope people agree with you, because that's what we tried to do.
It worked.
Arthur, you there?
I think I'm there. Can you read me? Can you hear?
We can hear you. What would you like to talk about, Arthur? Arthur?
Oh,
Are you?
Arthur, you got the floor. You got to take it.
Are you muted?
No, he's not muted. Okay, Arthur, you got to do it now or forever hold your peace. All right, anybody else have anything they want to talk about in open forum?
Yeah.
If not, Liz, no? All right.
Yeah. Ron's still here, right, Ron? Anyway, I wanted to say a couple of things. First of all, I wanted to encourage Ron to not think that—
I am still here.
Hi there. I wanted to, a couple of things I wanted to tell you, that there was I don't know if you're aware of something called the Nothing Wasted podcast, but there was a young woman, a materials designer, that was talking about designing material with the an end of use that is earth friendly in mind, and got together an entire huge consortium of packaging people to talk about this very thing. And so I think that you're going to see the industry turn a little bit on this. In other words, it almost needs to be from the materials engineering place. And the second thing I want to tell you is, don't assume that consumers, I actually even hate the word consumers, that people won't change something they've gotten used to. And the example I would give you is Costco, who got rid of bags. They simply stopped doing it. And everyone went, oh, okay. And they kind of got used to that idea, and they just kind of did a game change. So all I would encourage you, especially being a young entrepreneur like you are, is to keep your eyes and ears open, because I think it's going to be a really, really dynamic design environment. And it'd be neat to be on the leading edge of it because you care about that stuff. And again, I would say that is in something called Nothing Wasted podcast. And there's a young woman there that invites all kinds of people from the industry to speak on cutting edge topics that have to do with waste diversion or waste prevention.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, appreciate that. Yeah, I think, the hardest thing for us as a business is really trying to nail the product development, and be cutting edge, while also building what is a stable, not overly risky business model. And that's where I think for us, trying to build it from the ground up has been useful, is because we can kind of deal with different margins, their expectations around the product. And then it just kind of comes to, can we grow the business fast enough or well enough to where, we have investors in our company. I'm not self-funding this,
Okay.
nor could we, just given the business model that we have and the cost. And so, it's a question for us around having these conversations with our investors around, we're trying to build a sustainable packaging company, not necessarily the fastest growing or most profitable packaging company. But how do you find that balance with, the money, basically, to get them interested in it? And obviously there are people who are interested in, ESG businesses, but still it's a tough sell to any investor when you tell them, your decisions are made more around trying to be cutting edge or, as impactful as possible versus what is, less risky or quicker, to market feasibility or something along those lines.
Yeah.
Well, let me throw out a story then for you, Ron, because I've represented a business that did grow and had many of the same difficulties that you're telling. But the biggest one that you also mentioned was educating the consumer. In your case, if you wanted people to buy your product because it's a Santa packaging product, they have to know why that's important. And that's not easy to educate consumers, especially in at a quick retail kind of sale like cannabis. So the company that I'm thinking about sold pet food, and they were selling high dollar, high nutrition food, and they had to convince people why they should buy a $50 bag of dog food when they could go to the Safeway and get one for $20. So they had to find somebody who was willing to do that education. And they, without getting into the details, they found the pet rescue places, the SPCAs, the people that were adopting out animals. And they invested heavily in working with them, because if you adopted your animal from a rescue agency and you got a little package of the dog food that came from this one store, you were probably going to go back to that store and get the same food. I'm not saying that's the best example, but it's an example of how you can try to reach out to somebody else that will take the laboring or on their nickel to do the educating. And that's a hard thing. So good luck with it.
Yeah, no, thank you for that.
All right. We will be back the second Tuesday of next month, 5 o'clock for cocktails, 5:30 for the show. The Recycling Archives will feature Max Wexler's father, who was an old time scrap dealer and will be colorful from that. We don't have the other topic pinned down yet, but I guarantee it'll be interesting. So thank you again for joining us, and we will see you next time.
Thanks, John.
Okay. Thanks for being our featured speaker, featured archivist.
My pleasure.